Hello everyone, welcome back to Sigil. My name is Kevbot, and this is the third episode in my series on the history of D&D, one book at a time, where I take an anthropological approach to understanding the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it. In this episode, I'm going to analyze the efforts to spread Dungeons & Dragons throughout 1974, as well as efforts to grow the company Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR. My focus in this episode will be on how Gary Gygax overcame the barriers that D&D faced during its initial release in 1974, as well as how he worked to overcome the financial struggles of TSR in its early days. We've got a ton of information to cover today, so let's get started. We left off at the end of the last video in February 1974. Gary Gygax had successfully overcome two major hurdles throughout the year of 1973. Collaborating with Dave Arneson, he was able to get the rules for Dungeons & Dragons written. Partnering with Don Kay and Brian Bloom, he was able to raise the capital to start the partnership of Tactical Studies Rules and get 1,000 copies of Dungeons & Dragons printed. On February 7th, Gygax wrote in a postcard to Arneson, "Printer has D&D nearly done, so your copy should be in the mail by next week." And sure enough, the graphic printing company would return the last of the 3 booklets by the second week of February. But now, the hard part lay ahead of Gygax. Was D&D a saleable game? Was the game teachable? Marketable? Desirable? It is only with hindsight that we can look back at Dungeons & Dragons and the billions of dollars generated by the tabletop role-playing game industry that points to it being a success. But at the time, there were far more hurdles that pointed to Dungeons & Dragons being destined to be a failure. Almost all of the initial hurdles that Gygax had to overcome when attempting to market Dungeons & Dragons originate in the intended consumer base for the game, that being the communities of board and miniature wargamers. We know that Gygax initially marketed D&D as a wargame to board and miniature wargamers for 2 reasons: himself being a prolific member of these communities for several years prior, and the subtitle of the game stating that Dungeons & Dragons is a set of rules for wargame campaigns to be used with miniature figures. This community and potential consumer base was tiny. Strategy and Tactics 42 gives an estimate of roughly 100,000 board and miniature wargamers in 1974, which is only at most 100,000 potential customers. And the game itself lacked many familiar features expected from a board or miniature wargame. There was no board that a board wargamer would expect to be included, and no set of combat rules that necessitates the use of miniature figures expected by miniature wargamers. Both of these exclusions would be listed as optional extra products for players to purchase: the board from Avalon Hill's Outdoor Survival, and the combat rules from Guide on Games' Chainmail. Instead, D&D relied heavily on the use of paper and pencil to create dungeon maps, a gameplay feature with no direct precedent. So, even though the game was marketed towards board and miniature wargamers, it did not include fundamental elements that would be familiar to them. Instead, it would include many elements that were seen by some in the community as controversial. The game would include the use of many different types of polyhedral dice. Instead of just the D6 that board and miniature wargamers primarily used, it required players to also purchase a D4, D8, D12, and D20, dice that were not commonplace at the time and could be difficult and expensive to source. Players would need to purchase these dice on their own, as further compounding the issue of accessibility. The game did not include them in the box. Also controversial were the fantastic elements of the game itself. As we looked at with the release of the Fantasy Supplement in Chainmail in the first video in this series, many wargamers took their hobby as a serious adult intellectual pastime, and found the inclusion of fantastic elements in the wargames to be childish. D&D would take this inclusion to another extreme, being a game that was almost entirely based around fantastic situations, monsters, and heroes in a medieval setting. Generally speaking, this split the already small community of wargamers between those in favor of these fantastic elements, generally the younger gamers, and those against it, generally the older and more influential voices within the community. Along with the fantastical elements of the game that would turn off some wargamers, D&D also introduced several innovative systems of gameplay that were unfamiliar to wargamers, such as experience points, hit points, and level progression. The rulebooks did a poor job at fully explaining these new concepts, making how to play the game itself ambiguous, confusing, and open to interpretation in several key areas. Unlike other board and miniature wargames, D&D also required a neutral referee to invest hours of work into understanding these rules well enough to adjudicate outcomes and the gameplay itself, as well as hours invested into preparing and designing dungeons, as the game did not come included with dungeons to use. Finally, there was the cost of the game, along with the notion of paying money for wargame rules in general. Before Guidon Games, and now TSR, attempted to make a business on selling wargame rules, rules were given away for free, either by being published in wargaming scenes, or along with sets of miniature figures, to incentivize gamers to purchase armies of miniature figures. In this sense, the rules were seen as about as valuable as the packaging of the miniatures themselves. And now, TSR was looking not only to sell these rules, but to sell them at the exorbitant price of $10 per set, which is the equivalent of $65 in 2025 money, all for 3 small pamphlets. Taking all of these barriers into account, D&D seemed destined for failure, and the idea of ever finding even 1,000 buyers for the initial printing, ludicrous. While in hindsight we can criticize companies like Avalon Hill or Guidon Games for not publishing D&D when Gygax initially pitched it to them, viewed in context, they could never have seen it becoming the success it would eventually become. In fact, even Gygax and Arneson didn't realize the potential of the game, as indicated in the initial royalty agreement and evaluation of the value of the game. In the initial royalty agreement for Dungeons & Dragons, dated January 4th, 1974, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson would each receive a 10% royalty on the selling price of the set or single booklet or any attendant part of the set other than the artwork, a royalty agreement closely modeled after those of Guidon Games. In exchange for the royalty payments, the co-authors shall assign to the publisher the copyright, the right to publish, sell, and distribute sets of the game to be entitled Dungeons & Dragons as booklets and other similar rights. However, in the event that TSR could not profit from the sales of D&D, Gygax and Arneson could repurchase D&D from TSR if it went out of print at a fair price upon market demand at such time, but in no event exceeding $300. Essentially, they estimated that D&D would be at best a $300 game. Such a low valuation for the game indicates that Gygax and Arneson were well aware of the aforementioned challenges that they would face with selling D&D to the wargamers. These concerns were realized upon the initial slow sales, as by the end of the first quarter in March 1974, TSR had only managed to sell 81 copies of the game, amounting to about $50 for each Gygax and Arneson. Although TSR had planned to release a few other games in 1974, none compared to the potential profit that D&D would generate with its $10 price, and the economic reality of their situation would put a halt on producing any other publications. As the entire treasury of TSR had gone to printing D&D, they would not be able to produce any other products until sales of D&D started to generate a return for the company, a slow process given the generous royalty agreements paid to Gygax and Arneson on each sale. To print 1,000 copies of a new 32-page digest-sized booklet, the graphic printing company required a baseline of roughly $750. However, subsequent printings would be cheaper due to the graphic printing company having the necessary galleys. Gygax estimated in a letter to Arneson that for D&D, TSR will be lucky to break even with the first 1,000, but the next 1,000 will be a whale of a lot cheaper, about 1/2 the cost. Therefore, any realistic potential for profit on D&D relied on a second printing. But would anyone even buy the first 1,000 copies, let alone more? Gygax would try to recruit Arneson to help with selling D&D, as even though Arneson was not employed by TSR, he would still benefit from each sale of the game thanks to the royalty agreement. Most of the early sales of D&D would be through distribution partners such as Heritage Games, who would take more than half off the cover price. So Gygax, Arneson, and TSR would stand to make more profit from direct mail order sales. In a letter Gygax wrote to Arneson in March, he emphasized that every flyer you pass out could mean more royalty dollars. Remember, every retail sale we make is $1 to you. Put a flyer in all letters, alright? A week later, Gygax would again write to Arneson, seeing as how you and I each make a buck on the retail sale by TSR, we have to be dreaming up ways to promote the same. Get to work. However, mere word of mouth would not be enough to increase the sales of D&D, and this struggle will be compounded by a lack of a proper advertising budget for the game. As almost the entirety of TSR's coffers had gone into paying for the first printing of D&D, TSR was in no financial position to pay for advertising D&D with traditional ads in the wargaming zines. As Gygax would write to Arneson, it costs about $40 to set up the copy, and the ads will run about $125. So we'll hold off for a bit, like I said. Beyond the cost of advertising itself, it made little sense for TSR to invest in advertising at this point, as with only Cavaliers and Roundheads and D&D available for sale, TSR didn't offer enough products for an advertisement to realistically garner a return on the investment. As Gygax would write to Arneson, it doesn't pay to advertise without as large a selection of materials as possible. With, for example, a dozen sets of rules and a couple of games, any ad has a far better chance of interesting more people, thus paying for itself and even making a bit of loot. So, in lieu of traditional advertisements, Gygax came up with a different way to spread word of D&D. He wrote articles to publish in wargaming zines, ostensibly prose in the form of battle reports, that would promote the games TSR was offering. Writing advertisements disguised as articles had several hidden benefits over traditional advertisements that would work to overcome many of the initial barriers that D&D faced upon its release. Firstly, Gygax would not have to pay to get his articles printed in the wargaming zines like traditional advertisements. In fact, money generally flowed the other way, and Gygax would be paid to write these articles. Secondly, these articles would be important in describing exactly what D&D is and how to play through an illustrative example of the game itself and its relationship to fantasy literature and wargaming, something that the printed rules do an infamously poor job at. The 3 rulebooks lack any coherent instruction on how to use the rules to run an adventure. The closest the rules come to this is the 2-page example of the referee moderating a dungeon expedition, written as a dialogue between a referee and the caller for the players. It is a short narrative of 3 adventurers exploring underworld passages until they reach a room with half a dozen gnolls. After killing the gnolls and searching the room for treasure, the party returns to exploring. The adventure will continue in this manner until the party leaves the dungeon or are killed therein, the section concluded. While this explains the basics of participating in a dungeon adventure, it does a poor job in illustrating exactly why this would be fun for players or the referee. Gygax's advertisements as articles, however, would be able to illustrate this in great detail through the exciting battle reports of a typical D&D adventure. In a letter to Arneson, Gygax explained this advertisement strategy of selling D&D with ads and stories, with plenty of graphic work to put it across with POW, and begged Arneson to do the same. In the first half of 1974, Gygax would write 3 of these articles to advertise the feeling of playing D&D to the wargaming world and illustrate how to play the game. These articles are valuable from an anthropological perspective to understand Gygax's authorial intent for how the game should be played back in 1974, as they drew directly from examples of his gameplay, both as a referee and as a player. These articles illustrate the aspects of the game that Gygax initially found compelling, and we see how Gygax meant to abstract an overarching story from the mechanical details of dice rolls, combat charts, and cartography found in the rulebooks. The first of these articles was printed in the April 1974 issue of Great Plains Game Player newsletter, titled The Giant's Bag, an account of wilderness adventure in fantasy wargaming, and follows the same tradition of a typical wargaming battle report. In the story, Nestor never casts a spell, and there is little description of any combat. Instead, the focus is primarily on the negotiations between Nestor and the giant regarding distribution of the treasure, driven by irony and greed, and eventually resulting with the giant outsmarting and cheating Nestor for much of the treasure. While it may seem odd that Gygax would choose this story to advertise the fun and excitement of D&D, a story where the player is cheated out of wealth by a giant, the story does set the initial tone and expectation for what kind of fantasy D&D was aiming to recreate. Not an epic fantasy that one might expect from The Lord of the Rings, but much closer to that of a Jack Vance story. Even the title, Nestor the Clever, found in the story, is likely a reference to Kugel the Clever, the protagonist from Vance's Eyes of the Overworld. Therefore, this storytelling approach illustrates the type of story that a game of Dungeons & Dragons could reproduce, something that is otherwise unclear from reading the rules alone. This issue of GPGPN does include one of the rare early advertisements that TSR could afford at the time, and that's because this inclusion in the issue was free. The editor of GPGPN, James Louvry, had free access to his university's printing press to publish the zine on the condition that he received no financial compensation for it, so he did not charge TSR for the advertisement and printed it for free. The advertisement displays the term sword and sorcery in large font even larger than the title of Dungeons and Dragons itself, to draw on the general growing popularity of the genre. While this advertisement contains the mundane particulars, such as how to order it from TSR, it is the accompanying story of the Giant's Bag that does the real selling of the game. Gygax would follow up the Giant's Bag with another short story in the May 1974 edition of Wargamers Digest, an untitled story within the article Sword and Sorcery in Wargaming. Before getting into the story, Gygax gives a brief rundown of fantasy and wargaming, mentioning chainmail and the efforts in both the Twin Cities and Lake Geneva, leading into a description of how the game system in Dungeons and Dragons is used to create fantastic campaigns. In contrast to Nestor's low-level wilderness adventure in the Giant's Bag, where the magic user Nestor doesn't even cast a spell, this story follows the exploits of the 13th and 11th level magic users Mordenkainen and Bigby, delving into a dungeon of an equally high level, where even death itself is presented as a temporary inconvenience. Also in contrast, where in the first story we see Gygax as the referee, here we see Gygax as the player, with his character of Mordenkainen. So both stories taken together give a more complete picture of how Gygax intended the game to be played from both roles. While the article does not directly advertise Dungeons and Dragons, at the end, Gygax does write that was to his knowledge the only fantasy campaign rules available, and to give it a go, as it is a whale of a lot of fun. He mentions only that the game is sold by TSR, but no practical ways to purchase it. The last of the three 1974 fictions would be printed in the August 1974 edition of the zine El Conquistador. Titled The Expedition into the Black Reservoir, it follows the character of Eric, another character played by Ernie, delving into a dungeon below Castle Greyhawk, with Gygax again as the referee. Of the three stories, this one is the longest, most well written, and does the strongest job at describing what was likely a typical game of D&D at the time. However, in comparison to the last article, this one does not mention the name Dungeons and Dragons at all, or anything to suggest that it is a game to purchase. Although Gygax's approach to advertising in the first half of 1974 through articles would keep advertising costs low and work to spread knowledge about the game itself, this unconventional approach was a slow one, and it did not quickly translate into sales of D&D. For traditional sets of wargaming rules, they tended to have an initial flash of popularity with a long tail of sales afterwards. TSR's first product, Cavaliers and Roundheads, followed this trajectory. While it sold well initially upon release in 1973, by 1974, Gygax would write to Arneson admitting that sales of the game had really slowed. As for D&D, an expensive and innovative game, it did not have the same benefit of a safer set of wargame rules like Cavaliers and Roundheads, so it did not see the same high sales upon its release. Sales of the game through the second quarter of 1974 remained flat. After selling around 81 copies in the first quarter, they would sell just over 100 copies between April and June 1974. At this point, D&D and TSR both appeared to be failures as commercial and business ventures, and something would need to be done to save TSR. Gygax knew that his best chance to save TSR would be to produce more wargaming titles, as they could benefit off the initial sales bump as seen with releases like Cavaliers and Roundheads. However, as all of TSR's capital had gone into printing D&D, and D&D had not produced much in the way of profits by this point, TSR had no capital to print a new game. Gygax and Kay looked at the possibility of admitting a fourth partner into TSR to raise funds, like they had with Brian Bloom to raise the money for the initial printing of D&D, but given the sales and direction the company was heading, who would invest in TSR at this point? Gygax made his frustrations of the situation known in his letter to Arneson on July 3rd in 1974, noting that Dawn isn't about to come up with any more loot, and how it is most difficult to make a firm run properly without plenty of capital. Without capital to produce new products, Gygax did have one way for TSR to quickly and relatively cheaply acquire games to sell: Don Lowry and his failing Guidon Games. Although Gygax and Arneson were still in an ongoing dispute with Lowry regarding royalties for their games that were being sold by Guidon, Gygax would propose to Lowry that TSR buy the rights and existing stock for the games Chainmail, Don't Give Up the Ship, and Tractics, for the total sum of $400. This low cost to buy the rights and unsold products for 3 games further puts into perspective the initial evaluation of D&D as, at best, a $300 idea. Lowry, in debt to creditors and on the verge of bankruptcy, had no choice but to accept Gygax's offer, and TSR would add these 3 games to their list of games for sale without the upfront printing costs. To the end, Gygax would defend Lowry, but continue to criticize his business acumen. Writing in a letter to Arneson in May 1974, Don's a nice guy, a piss poor business manager, but a nice chap. While selling the wargaming community on a game as novel as Dungeons and Dragons was proving to be an immense challenge, there was one event that would have a large impact on the sale of D&D throughout the rest of 1974, Gen Con 7. Held again at the Horticultural Hall and expanded to 3 days from August 23rd to 25th, 1974, there were roughly 600 attendees for this year's convention. It was clear that the scope of the gaming convention had shifted. There were only a few board war games on sale, mainly due to the presence of hobby shops, as the primary focus was on miniatures, with most vendors having fantasy offerings. While there were several different vendors for miniature figures, the largest and most established was the English company Miniature Figures, or Minifigs for short, who would produce a line of 25mm miniature figures from Middle-earth. Don Lowry would stock this line of miniatures and mark them as for use with the Chainmail Fantasy Supplement. This shift of Gen Con to focus heavily on fantasy miniature figures was no mere coincidence, and was done purposely to help promote Gygax and Arneson's new set of rules for fantastic medieval wargame campaigns, playable with miniature figures. Of course, this is a bit ironic, as use of miniature figures in D&D is completely optional, but it is likely that Gygax and Arneson would have used these fantasy miniature figures during the D&D games they were running at Gen Con to help with demonstrating the game. This convention was Gygax's ace in the hole. Use Gen Con to demonstrate D&D to the wargamers. While the rules do a poor job at explaining the gameplay for D&D, and Gygax's articles as advertisements did only a slightly better job, it would only take one session of playing with Gygax, Arneson, or any other member of their close circle at Gen Con for wargamers to instantly understand how to play the game, and once they were hooked, purchase a copy of the game. Gygax knew this from his experience of introducing the game to fellow wargamer Gary Gygax in June. Gygax bought a copy of D&D, but struggled to fully understand the rules. After getting a chance to play with Gygax at a small gaming convention in Madison, Wisconsin, he would write in a letter to Gygax, "Your group from Lake Geneva made the convention for me by giving me an insight into the Dungeons and Dragons rules. The rules are easy to understand, but there was so much there that it is a bit overwhelming, and I was only rather slowly figuring it all out. Playing with experienced players has given me some very real help. I have been struggling with the rules for a couple of weeks, and now I understand the basics and can get on with learning the details I need for my own dungeons." Gen Con would be Gygax's chance to provide this experience for hundreds of wargamers. Former IFW president Bill Hoyer would write in the September issue of the American Wargamer, "This year's convention was centered mainly around the new set of Gygax and Arneson's rules, Dungeons and Dragons. On Saturday, at least a dozen games were in progress, and as soon as one ended, another was started. And in Signal, that it was the hit of the convention, with game masters having games going in all parts of the hall." Another review in the same issue of Signal corroborates that a number of fantasy scenarios were well attended. While the previous Gen Cons were significant as they allowed wargamers around the country a chance to come together to play games and build connections within the community, Gen Con 7 truly ushered in a new era of gaming. Gen Con 7 officially introduced Dungeons and Dragons to the broader wargaming community in a way that gamers could finally understand, by demonstration, what Dungeons and Dragons was, in a way infinitely better than any written set of rules or articles could explain. Gamers from around the country bought these rules, brought them back home to their local wargaming clubs, and the rules of this novel game would spread across the country from there. Though they did not have the name for it yet, this would usher in a new era, not of board or miniature war games, but of role-playing games. After Gen Con 7, even the board wargame juggernaut Avalon Hill could sense the shift, seeing D&D as something more than a mere prototype. While it is impossible to conclusively determine a single cause for the increase in sales of D&D, there was a perceptible increase in sales during the third quarter of 1974 following Gen Con. Before Gen Con, TSR was bringing in roughly $100 per week in sales of D&D. After Gen Con, this would more than double. This growth was due not mainly to sales of D&D during Gen Con itself, but subsequent sales from gaming groups around the country, as the game was brought and introduced to other gamers from the Gen Con attendees, who had an opportunity to play with Gygax and Arneson. As more groups around the country began to play D&D, more zine articles detailing local campaigns would also begin to organically pop up in wargaming zines, which would further spark interest in sales in the game. The spread of D&D throughout wargaming groups across the country after Gen Con, and subsequent articles about the game published in wargaming zines, gives a fascinating insight into what early adopters thought of the game and how they played it. Many of these insights would shape revisions to the game and expansions in the coming years. One of the earliest insights into the game was from former IFW member Jim Dapkus from Madison, Wisconsin. He deemed it a rather unique set of rules, noting that the rules offer a new twist to gaming, since the game can be played out using only pencil and paper and a map, and it did not require board or miniatures. Dapkus keyed in on several other novel features of D&D, separating it from board and miniature wargames, observing how, as you fight monsters and other players for treasure, you move up the ladder of wealth and experience. You no longer command an army, you yourself become the army, and whatever influence you are able to project, your followers will gather around. The fundamental law of the game is that you are a person, with so much ability, trying to stay alive in a hostile environment. Dapkus offered one criticism for the game, that being the lack of roles for female characters in the rules. I asked Gary what women's livers think of the situation, and he told me that he will bend to their demands when a member of the opposite sex buys a copy of Dungeons & Dragons. Considering the fact that the wargaming community at the time was almost exclusively made up of men, Gygax could never have anticipated how quickly Dungeons & Dragons would cross this gender gap. Detroit area gamers began playing D&D shortly after Gen Con 7, thanks to Mike Bartnowski being spurred to buy a copy of the game for himself after seeing a game of D&D in progress and introduce it to the gamers in Michigan. In issue 25 of Bartnowski's zine, interest group Highland Park, dated September 1974, Bartnowski wrote that Dungeons & Dragons looks to be a multiplayer thing that, despite the costs, seems well worth it. While many early reviews complained about the high price of $10, the Detroit gamers noted that only one set of rules was needed for the game that could support more than 2 players at a time, unlike a typical board wargame. In the November issue of IGHIP, we get the first battle report of the Michigan group's D&D adventures, as well as the lengthy Dungeons & Dragons progress report, written by Bartnowski, with advice for new adopters for the game. It takes a great deal of preparation to make the underworld portion of Dungeons & Dragons, D&D, work well for game participants. A recent practice game required 4 to 6 hours in map making and careful specification of all particulars. The game is only as rich as the imagination of the creator of the underworld scene. Bartnowski also noted that the game itself can be time-consuming. One experience showed a party of 5 took 2.5 hours, real time, to explore 3 rooms and conduct 2 melees. Despite these concerns, it is clear from these articles that the Michigan gamers were highly taken in by D&D. In the Courier, Arnold Hendrick emphasizes some of the difficulties of understanding the D&D rules as written. Beyond criticizing the price of the game, Hendrick noted that vastly too much has been attempted in these booklets, with very little detail, explanations, or procedures. He recognized that D&D falls outside the parameters of a traditional miniature wargame, and had some reservations in even referring to it as a game at all. Instead, he noted it represents an attempt to outline a system for playing the kind of fantasy adventures one previously read about in paperbacks. Hendrick makes the comparison between D&D and Korn's 1966 Modern War in Miniature, noting the common dialogue structure. The referee is informed of each action, and after consulting the maps he has made, the basic tables and information in the booklets, and his own imagination, he gives the players a response. He concluded that the scope is just too grand, while the referee is expected to do too much in relation to the players. While Hendrick conceded that the concept and imagination involved is stunning, he finished, "I do not suggest these to the average wargamer." In the October edition of American Wargamer, Bill Hoyer starts his review of D&D with a paragraph describing a dungeon adventure, followed by a list of each book's contents, but stopped short of a detailed review. Much too long to go into detail here. Hoyer did, however, make note of the extensibility of D&D. These rules, being open-ended, are capable of being changed by the players to develop new monsters and even better treasure. And the review does end with an endorsement. By all means, buy a set. In the same issue of American Wargamer, Kevin Slimak of Boston wrote that Dungeons & Dragons made its appearance at the MIT Strategic Game Society just recently, and seems to be making a hit. These MIT players included Mark Swanson, who would play a crucial role in introducing the game to the West Coast. Beyond reviews and articles about D&D and zines throughout 1974, probably the most significant indicator of how wargamers were engaging with D&D from an anthropological perspective was the creation of the Thief class. The third booklet for Dungeons & Dragons, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, ends with a call to action for gamers. The trimmings will oftentimes have to be added by the referee and his players. We have attempted to furnish an ample framework, and building should be both easy and fun. Why have us do any more of your imagination for you? Write to us and tell us about your additions, ideas, and what have you. And it is exactly through this means that the Thief class would come about, from a group of D&D players all the way out at Aero Hobbies in Santa Monica, California. Gygax would recall the origin of the Thief class as follows. Recently, I received a telephone call from Gary Switzer, who hails from sunny California. It isn't all that sunny out there, however, for there are many dungeon expeditions regularly being led through the grim piles of the castles which are scattered throughout the land. Anyway, during the course of our conversation, he mentioned that his group was developing a new class of character, Thieves. Gary gave me a few details of how they were considering this character type, and from these I've constructed tentative rules for the class. As the original rules only included the fighting man, magic user, and cleric, and given popular fantasy tropes such as Conan the Barbarian, it would almost seem inevitable that the Thief class would be created as the next logical addition to the game. Although there was some debate as to who actually first came up with the idea of the Thief class, most now believing it to be Daniel Wagner of Aero Hobbies, we know it was Gary Switzer who would call and share this class to Gary Gygax. Gygax would then set about writing and publishing the rules for it, the first addition to the game, even before new monsters, magic items, or spells. The story of how the Thief class came about reflects a combination of many prevalent elements regarding D&D at the time. Gygax's willingness to continue to collaborate on the rules, the incompleteness of the game inviting such collaboration, and the deep investment of players towards these rules. This last point would turn out to be maybe the most important for the tabletop role-playing game community over the next 50 years, with gamers working not only to write editions for every edition of D&D, but also hundreds of different game systems spawning from D&D since 1974 and through to today. Gygax would write up the rules for his version of the Thief class and publish them in Great Plains Game Player newsletter, which would be printed as a 4-page insert designed to be easily removed and sized to fit in the wood grain boxes for D&D. Frustratingly in this publication, Gygax attributes the idea to Gary Schweitzer, not Gary Switzer, a frustration regarding proper accreditation that will continue with the official publication of the class in the Greyhawk expansion. Even at this early stage, the Thief class contained many new aspects that would appear in almost all later iterations of the class, including being able to open locks, remove traps, steal, backstab, hide in shadows, and move silently. GPGPN became the main zine for Gygax to publish rules expansions for D&D, and would publish new rules for the fighting men as well in the next edition, granting fighting men of exceptional strength bonuses in their chance to hit, damage dealt, and amount of weight they can carry. These rules, both for the Thief class and fighting man, would be officially published next year in the Greyhawk expansion. As D&D began to spread, it would also influence existing fantasy games. One of the most notable influences D&D had was on Thomas Drake's postal fantasy game, Midgard II. In the November 1974 issue of Midgard Forum, Drake wrote, "Got a hold of Gary Gygax's new thing, Dungeons & Dragons, and it is fantastic. No pun intended. If you're interested in such, it is a must-buy." Co-game master Scott Rich would write that they adopted a lot of D&D to Midgard, including combat odds for different polyhedral dice, and the technique of setting up underground mazes on several levels and stocking them with treasures and creatures. He indicated that he would set these up all over Midgard. Sure enough, Midgard would include elements of dice rolling determining creatures encountered in the underworld, and many monsters and treasures taken from Monsters and Treasures. Like the Thief class, the idea of Midgard adapting elements of D&D into the game system further reflected the collaborative nature of the wargaming community at the time. For his part, Gygax would continue to endorse Midgard throughout 1975, as the more the game adapted D&D's system, the more likely that Midgard players might go out and buy a copy of D&D itself, even if the initial inclusion of the elements from D&D would obviate any of the players from needing to go out to buy the rules. While Gygax was happy with the community collaboration and innovation that led to the Thief class and system changes to Midgard, his spirit towards collaboration would change in regards to any perceived business threat to TSR. This friction and tension between community collaboration and running a business will be another aspect that influences the TTRPG community for the next 50 years, and Gygax first encountered it with M.A.R. Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne. Barker was a university professor in Minnesota and one of the earliest adopters of D&D. His personal copy of the game is dated February 19th, 1974. Barker would adopt the game system of D&D to his homebrew fictional world of Tecumel, a fictional world he had been developing since the 1950s that was on a scale of detail and complexity that would rival Tolkien. By August 1974, Barker had a manuscript for this game he had written by applying D&D to Tecumel, which he called Empire of the Petal Throne. Barker then licensed the game to be published by another rules startup company called World at War, run by a member of the Twin Cities gaming group, Bill Hoyt. Arneson would send a copy of Empire of the Petal Throne in eagerness to Gygax, seeing it as a possible acquisition for TSR. However, instead of reacting in eagerness, Gygax was outraged at what he saw as a blatant act of plagiarism, with the rules so closely derived from D&D and a threat to TSR. Writing back to Arneson, Gygax said, "If we allow copyright infringement now, who knows where it will end." What I really regretted was the lack of courtesy shown by Barker in the first place, for he never sent a copy of his adaptation to TSR. Barker kept mentioning the good of the hobby, evidently not realizing it is a business which TSR runs. Business with several thousands in personal funds of the partners, which are invested to show a profit. Gygax included a thinly veiled threat of legal action as well, writing that our lawyer said that in his opinion, a suit could be instituted without much difficulty if the work was published in the form it is in now. One must not forget that Dungeons & Dragons had been birthed out of a collaborative wargaming community, incorporating aspects of Dave Wesley's Bronstein, Dave Arneson's Blackmoor, Dave McGarry's Dungeon, and Gary Gygax's Chainmail. But now that Gygax was running TSR, could products designed for the good of the hobby continue to survive in the world of capitalism? For their part, Hoyt did recognize that some royalty or credit towards D&D for Empire of the Petal Throne was due, and they would work together with Gygax over the next few months to settle the dispute. As for Arneson, he would write back to Gygax, "I do not wish to touch the Barker deal with a 10-foot pole, since I will have to live with it on this end, but would insist, I felt, and still do, that Barker had something TSR could use." At this point, Arneson remained discontented with the state of D&D in general. Throughout 1974, Gygax would encourage Arneson to write articles promoting D&D like he had been, but Arneson was more focused on historical and naval wargaming happening in the Twin Cities. Arneson would continue to complain about the published version of D&D in his correspondence throughout the year, reflecting on the previous year's struggles in collaboration with Gygax and how the game did not represent many of his visions. He would write a letter to Great Plains Game Player newsletter for publication on October 9, 1974, indicating that there was a certain amount of communication breakdown between himself and Gygax, reviewing places where Gygax had overruled his ideas. GPGPN would not publish this letter until the next year, as by this point, they were the primary publication for promoting D&D. However, it is clear from this that his collaboration with Gygax had already become dysfunctional. The third quarter growth in sales after Gen Con would continue throughout the fourth quarter as well, as word of the game continued to spread, doubling again to roughly 420 more copies sold in the fourth quarter to close out the year. By the end of 1974, TSR had depleted its stock of the first 1,000 copies of D&D through both its sales to its distribution partners and direct mail order. As copies of the game became scarce and word of the game continued to spread, gamers started photocopying the rules. Mark Miller of Game Designers Workshop would recall, "Initially we played from Xeroxes of the rule booklets. We couldn't wait for an order to be filled before we started. Also, given the high cost of the rules, some wargamers felt morally justified in running these illicit copies." In Alarms and Excursions, Dick Eney wrote that the retail price of D&D so vastly exceeded its likely production costs and questioned any condemnation of Xerox fandom. While illicit photocopies of the rules would hurt sales of the game in the short term, one could argue that it helped sales in the long term, as it would contribute greatly to the spread of the game. Gygax would later say, "I have no way of knowing how many pirated copies of D&D were in existence, but some estimates place the figure at about 20% of total sales, some as high as 50%. However, one thing that gamers couldn't photocopy was the polyhedral dice required to play the game, dice that were difficult to come by in 1974. TSR would sell these dice at a slight markup to generate further profit, while closely guarding the identity of their supplier, Creative Publications in Palo Alto, California. As Gygax would write to Arneson regarding dice sales, "Although we don't make much on them, it does give us a few pennies, gets people used to ordering from TSR by mail, and gets a mailing list too." By the end of November, TSR was ordering sets of 5 polyhedral dice in lots of 200 each. In the second week of December, TSR approved a second printing of D&D. As the cost of printing a second run would be lower than the first, this would provide TSR the long-awaited opportunity to realize a profit from the game. With sales continuing to double throughout the second half of 1974, and a second printing of the game on its way, a small ray of hope had begun to emerge. Was Gygax successful in overcoming the multitude of barriers for D&D upon its initial release? Could TSR successfully build a business around selling fantasy game rules, one that could financially support a modest amount of employees? Although it started to look promising, the viability of D&D and TSR was far from certain. In 1975 would prove to be just as crucial of a year in growing the company as 1974 was. However, the burden of taking TSR to the next level would fall squarely on Gygax's shoulders, for a very unwelcome reason. Thank you so much for watching the third episode of my series on the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it, one book at a time. What do you think about the story of how Gary Gygax overcame the barriers that D&D faced during its initial release in 1974 to grow in popularity, as well as how he worked to overcome the financial struggles of TSR in its early days? Did anything about the story of the initial efforts to spread Dungeons & Dragons throughout 1974, as well as the efforts to grow the company Tactical Studies rules, surprise you? Let me know in those comments down below. In the next episode, we'll take a look at how Gygax continued to grow TSR, as well as the publication of D&D's first expansion booklets, Greyhawk and Blackmore. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Kevbot, and I will see you in the next video.